Okay, this is on. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. This afternoon, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Seema Jayachandran. And most of you would already know of her and her work, but I'm just going to speak very briefly about her work. Seema is the professor of economics at Northwestern University. She's also the co-director of the Development Economics Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER in the US, and also the chair of the gender sector of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, the JPAL. So there's a lot of exciting work that's going to take off under Seema's stewardship related to gender issues, in particular within JPAL, and probably more broadly speaking, development economics. And Seema's also the co-editor of the American Economic Journal in Applied Economics, one of the offshoots of the AER, which started a few years ago. So Seema Jayachandran's research focuses on health, development economics, and also environmental economics. And a substantial body of her research concerns gender differences. And her work has been acknowledged through several awards, including the Sloan Research Fellowship in 2011, an NSF Career Award in 2011, and a Sustainability Science Award from the Ecological Society of America in 2018. So a very warm welcome to you, Seema. This public lecture and this, Seema Jayachandran's visit has been made possible with the generous support of what is called the IWWAGE initiative, housed at the IFMR lead. And Madhuri Mukherjee, who's the executive director of IWWAGE IFMR, is chairing this session. And before Seema takes the floor and gives her talk, I would like to invite Madhuri to just speak very briefly about this initiative, which is being funded by the Gates Foundation. So Seema Jayachandran will speak for about an hour or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions after that, once Dr. Mukherjee has said a few words about the IWWAGE initiative. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Farzana. So I think I'll just speak from here. And I'm really grateful to Dr. Farzana for organizing this public lecture. And I know you're all waiting to hear Professor Jayachandran, and I won't take much time. So as Dr. Farzana has mentioned, I'm part of IWAGE, which basically stands for Initiatives on What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy. And IWAGE is a pretty new initiative which was started in late 2017 as a collaboration between Gates Foundation and IFMR. And our objective is to generate evidence and build on existing evidence around women's economic empowerment, given that we have a room full of economists, researchers, data people. So it's the kind of work that IWAGE is looking forward to do, and in a more focused way in terms of women's economic empowerment. Our basic core strategies is to build on evidence, is to also develop new evidence, new data sets, do some new research, and influence policies through the evidence that we are building on. And the third thing that we're also looking forward to do is to bring different players together in this process. Because one of the reasons, the basic idea why IWAGE was set up was that, there's all the work that is happening in the evidence and research and the policy domain is very siloed. There are not many people who are bringing it all together, people who are doing the generation, the synthesis, and the use of evidence altogether. So that's something that was identified as a gap which IWAGE is looking forward to step in and interact, and as our collaboration with ISI is part of this initiative. And some of the areas of work that IWAGE is working on is looking at gender disaggregated databases on social and macroeconomic indicators around the status of women, around unpaid work for women, and also looking at evidence on impact of social protection policies on girls and women's well-being, and how this can be further used to take forward the policy discourse. And we are also looking at collectives as a forum for transformative leadership, and through a work that we are going to do as part of our experimental learning modeling kind of initiative. So basically these are some of the pieces of work that we are doing. And with ISI, we are working on few areas around female employment, and in the agriculture context, we are doing some studies around Ujjwala scheme, looking at how clean fuel is important for promoting women's well-being, around life cycle approach to labor supply decisions of women, and also looking at the work opportunities for women in the manufacturing sector. So we're looking forward to this collaboration with ISI and having more such interactions. With that, I'll hand it over to Professor Jayachandran.
Thank you, Farzana, for the introduction, and Madhavi for the introduction to IWWAGE. Do you want me to use the second mic too, or? Okay. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I'm going to move over here so I can see my slides a little bit. I'm excited to be part of this IWWAGE. I think it's great to. I'm going to talk about one aspect of gender inequality in India, but I think besides sort of the preference for sons at birth, I think another obviously big topic is women in the economy, and so I think it's exciting. And as Farzana mentioned, JPAL 1 year ago launched a gender sector, and I'm looking forward to seeing synergies between IWWAGE and JPAL's gender sector. So I'm going to talk for, I think, about 50 minutes on the consequences of son preference, mostly summarizing some of my research, but also beginning with a maybe bigger picture story about women in the economy and with the process of economic development. And so I wasn't sure what the range of backgrounds was going to be in the audience, and so for those of you who are researchers who specialize in this topic, this is going to maybe feel dumbed down, but hopefully that means I'm not going to lose too many people. Yeah, so the question. Yeah, so hopefully I won't lose anyone. Yeah, but the cost is we'll see if the experts in the room might know more than me on some of the things I'm about to say. So I'm going to start out by, as I said, giving a broad overview of kind of what's in the literature and economic theory about the links between gender inequality and economic development, and use that to sort of make maybe an obvious point that economics doesn't explain all of the evolution of gender equality and the importance of cultural norms. So I'm going to start with this figure, which is showing a correlation between a gender gap in education and the level of economic prosperity in countries. So this is a cross-section of countries using World Bank data. This is from an annual review article of mine from a few years ago. So the horizontal axis is countries are categorized by their GDP per capita. And what's on the vertical axis is one measure of gender inequality. This is the ratio of men to women who are getting a college education. And you could see that there's a downward sloping relationship. On the far left, in poorer countries, that ratio of men to women who are getting the opportunity or choosing to go to college is higher. As you move to the richer countries on the right, that ratio is falling. And in fact, for college is unique in that this is one metric that in the very richest countries, the ratio actually goes the other way. In the United States, more women than men are going to college. And so this is college education, but if I showed you secondary school education or primary school, you would see a similar relationship. And you could also use many other metrics of measures of well-being that we care about, where in general, men are getting more resources or have better measures of well-being than women, and that gap tends to be larger in developing countries. So this would be true for life expectancy. For various biological reasons, women tend to live longer than men in all societies, but that gap is smaller, that that biological advantage is offset by some presumably behavioral societal reasons in poorer countries. And you also see this for softer measures when the World Values Surveys ask questions about, do you feel like you have freedom over your own life? Do you have personal freedom to make choices in your life? Women relative to men are more likely to say no in poorer countries. And so, no matter how you cut it, when we think about it, every country is sort of trying to close gaps between men and women is on the policy agenda and important in all countries, but there's more need for improvement in poorer countries. There's maybe a more optimistic way to look at this figure, which is that maybe this is causal. Maybe this correlation is also telling us that as countries get richer, these gaps are closing, that there's something about the process of economic development that is helpful for women, or that's closing these gaps. And this is also just a correlation, but you see a similar pattern if you think about economic development, not across countries at one snapshot in time, but how countries evolve. So here I've aggregated countries. This is using census data, the census microdata that's available for various countries, and grouping them just into the sub-Saharan African sample and the Asian sample of these is restricted to low and middle income countries. And this is categorizing people by what their year of birth was now on the horizontal axis. And so as you get to younger cohorts, like people who were born later, there the opportunities, or the outcomes at least, for females relative to males are getting better. That they're still in 1963, people born in 1963, the males born in that year are having more education than the females, but as you get to their younger siblings and their children, those gaps are narrowing. And so, as I said, there's an optimistic story about this too. This is just a correlation. There can be many reasons, but it is sort of suggestive that there's a kind of a reason to be optimistic that the process of economic development might help. And so let me just sort of say a little bit about, and I guess I start with this because I am generally an optimist that there are good reasons to think that if we were laissez-faire about this, things would get better for women over time, at least in the societies where things are very bad to start with. That's not a justification for being laissez-faire. We might say, fine, this naturally economic forces are going to improve this over decades or a century, and we don't want to be that patient. So there's still a role for policy to speed things up. But I do think there are kind of good reasons why women might catch up to men, or at least these gaps, maybe not fully catch up, but the gaps will narrow over time. So this triptych is depicting, I think, three big economic forces that are part and parcel of what we mean by economic development, or they're either what drive or what are maybe coming about with economic development that tend to help women in the labor market. And so, I said that there are gaps not just in, not about the labor market, but about education and health and personal freedom. But, I think to the theme of IWWAGE, if women have better labor market opportunities, if they're more important, playing a bigger role in the economy, a lot of the other benefits might accrue. So it's hard to constrain a woman's personal freedom if she needs to go out and about to work, or she has a threat point that she could be economically self-sufficient if her family was constraining her. And similarly, if women are going to be in the workplace, that gives families an incentive to educate their daughters. So on the left, I think the big one is what economists call the structural transformation, the idea that with economic development, or what drives economic development, is a transition from agriculture and mining and sort of primary industries to manufacturing and services. And so, in agriculture, a lot of agriculture requires physical strength, and men have an absolute advantage in occupations that require physical strength. So, if pushing a plow requires upper body strength, on average, men have a lot more upper body strength than women. But with economic development becomes more jobs like professors, where you don't need a lot of upper body strength to be a professor, and women have a comparative advantage in these mentally intensive tasks. And so you don't have to take a stance on absolute advantage, but just the fact that relatively women are going to be more on par with with these jobs that are mentally intensive, it means that as economies evolve and you have more of these service mentally intensive tasks, that's going to mean women are earning more if they're working and are going to be more likely to be working. In the middle panel is a woman, fetching water from a standpipe. And home production, it's kind of dramatic how you could see this in India over the last 20 years. You could see this in the US from maybe 1950 to today, of how dramatically we've replaced labor-intensive home production of hand washing clothes and going out to fetch water from a standpipe, or fetching wood and chopping wood and fetching wood to cook, to using appliances, to having electrification and having washing machines. And so because women are doing the lion's share of those chores, when you no longer have to go walk to a water source and bring it back, but you can just turn on a pipe in your household, then that's going to free up women's time to have more attachment to the labor force. And they might still be doing home production and tied to the home much of the day, but that opens up time for part-time work or home-based work or something like that. And then the far right panel is a woman with her children, and dramatically with development, fertility rates fall. And so one of the things that a big factor in both labor force participation, but also the wage gap between men and women, is experience and continuity in the labor market. And so having a family size of having 2 children versus 5 children, that's going to make women more competitive in the labor market and be spending more time in the labor market. And alongside kind of the number of kids, another important factor is also just the riskiness of childbearing. So there's sort of a not well documented but large cost of labor productivity and of just all the complications from childbirth that affect women's health. And so even a woman who would have had 2 children and still having 2 children, just her health level afterwards is much better today than it was in the past. And so this is all to say that I think thinking about these broader trends and phenomena of economic development go pretty far in explaining that cross-sectional picture I showed you at the beginning, that in Sweden there's more gender equality than there is in Zimbabwe or India. But that's obviously not explaining everything. There's more gender equality in Sweden than the US, and there's probably more gender equality in Zimbabwe than India, at least on many metrics. And so what explains that? There are lots of places where countries are at the same level, and there's still variation. And so, and I think another thing, when I think about kind of what I've been working on just generally in development economics, I seem to be working on problems that are getting worse rather than better. So one, or at least in the recent history, that's like the sex ratio in India, that's been getting worse rather than getting better. The other broad area I'm working on right now is environmental quality. And some measures of environmental quality are improving, but some of them are getting worse. And so these are things where there might be reasons why the process of economic development isn't necessarily going to solve them, and in fact, sometimes they might make them worse. And so now you can't even have the option of a laissez-faire attitude and think these problems will get better. It certainly will require policy. And so I think as an example of a phenomenon where so far we haven't seen, at least even the correlation, that economic progress has solved it. And I don't, and if I sort of think about as much as I know about the phenomenon, and I'm not convinced that kind of future economic progress, or that there are theoretical reasons why economic progress is going to help. One example is just this preference to have sons in India. And so I'm going to spend a lot of this talk kind of delving into that. And it has various manifestations, this preference for son, but one of them is having sex-selective abortions and having a skewed sex ratio. And so this is the same setup of a figure as the very first one I showed you, where the horizontal axis is the GDP per capita, and the vertical axis is again a measure of something that is a bias in favor of males, and this is that male boys being born in the first place. relative to girls. And so you see this is not a downward sloping relationship. I said I could show you a bunch of things and you'd see something downward sloping. You don't see it for this. If anything, there's a slight upward slope. It's pretty small if you think about what that magnitude is, but at least it doesn't seem like there's much relationship with economic progress or economic development on this. And you also see that what's striking from this graph is that there are just some big outliers. They happen to be big in terms of population too, China and India, but there are places like Armenia and Vietnam. That there are other places in the world as well that there's a skewed sex ratio, and so there are places that have a range of economic development and that you're seeing this problem in, and you're seeing places with very similar levels of economic development where you see some places this is not a problem, in some places it is. And so I think of this as a very classic example where sort of my standard, the tools of economics in terms of empirical skills can still be very useful in understanding the problem, but just in terms of thinking of like broad economic forces, I don't think it's going to help me explain how this has evolved within one society or what is explaining the variation across the world. So I want to make one kind of important distinction that I think it's just kind of important in understanding where is the anomaly, like versus what's maybe more general and where standard economic arguments can help us understand it, which is when we use the phrase son preference, people can sometimes mean, or there are at least two different things you could be meaning. One is this desire to have sons, like you want to have a son in your family, and oh, sorry, I missed what slide I was going to talk about. Let me make this other point that I started to make because it's on a slide later, which is, there's both a desire to have sons and how much you invest in your sons versus your daughters. And so where you would see this exceptionalism, where you only see it in India and China and Armenia and a relatively small set of countries, is this idea of wanting a son. The idea of like investing more in sons than daughters is much more general phenomenon. This comes back to the labor market, and in places where people don't care as much that they have a son in their family, they're still going to generally spend more money on their son's education than their daughter's education. So this aspect, and if you look, I think a nice way to look at this is that historically, even before there was ever sex selection, you can look at the sex ratio of the last child. So the sex ratio of the last child, when people are just if you see that the last son is disproportionately male, you know that families must have had some implicit decision rule or explicit decision rule in their heads that we want a certain number of sons and we're going to keep trying and keep enlarging our family till we have as many sons as we want. And so you'll see that last child in the family will be disproportionately male. So it doesn't mean the whole population sex ratio is skewed, but it does mean that if you condition on that being the last child in the family, they're disproportionately male. And you see this historically, before there was sex-selective abortion, it's what you would see this in India, and it's a large enough magnitude that it's not infanticide. So if you went back to the censuses in the 1800s, yes, there's some documented infanticide, so that but even more so, you would see this pattern of a skewed sex ratio. If you go back historically in, say, the US or any Western European country, what's nice about this is you can go back to censuses and data sets and historically in countries. So you could say, if this is about economic development, let's look in European countries 100 years ago. Do we see this phenomenon that we're seeing in India today? And you don't see that. Historically there never was this pattern of like having enough sons is driving your fertility decisions in a family. So I think that so this was to say that I think both kinds of son preference exist in India, both investing more resources in your sons than your daughters. And India might be worse than Europe was historically, or it might be worse than Zimbabwe, but it's not, that general pattern, that existence of that favoritism for sons in spending money on them or giving them food is fairly general and larger at low levels of development. This desire to have sons is the aspect that I think is more exceptional in the world and sort of more exceptional in India. The other distinction that this is not necessarily a consensus view, this is just my read of the literature, and some of it is also just from sort of qualitative, formative research that's gone into my projects, and my own research is that the distinctive aspect of wanting sons, so now focusing on this desire to have sons, it's not across the board to always prefer to have sons than daughters. It's really this desire to have at least one son. And that might turn out to be a desire to have at least two sons because you're risk averse, and maybe that one son will have some health problems or be unreliable. So you might want to have two sons so that you have one surviving son. But just that desire to have that heir, that person who's going to take care of you, who's going to take over the family land and lineage, is very important to them. And so, part of the reason this is maybe, like not a innocuous point of view, is that, or why it's, one of its implications is that it suggests that like dowry is not the driving force of why people are having sex-selective abortions. Dowry has many other bad aspects, but I think if the reason people don't want sons is that it's really costly to have a daughter because she's going to be joining someone else's family and you're going to have to pay a dowry, then you sort of would want sons across the board, every daughter. Whereas, and I'll talk about one concrete study of mine that is suggesting, kind of once people have their one son, they're indifferent between daughters and sons, and if dowry was really looming large in their decisions to whether to have an abortion or what kind of family composition they wanted, they shouldn't be indifferent between having daughters and sons once they had their son. Every daughter should be costly to them. It might be driving other decisions about education or whether they let their daughters work or healthcare and things like that, but just on this sort of fertility decisions and sex selection, I'm not convinced it's important. Okay, so what is explaining this desire for having to want a son? I think there are a few reasons that people have pointed out. One is this idea of, I think one of the important ones is patrilocality, this idea and patrilineality, which almost always go hand in hand, though are distinct in concept. One is about where you're going to, who's going to kind of co-reside and take over and sort of care for parents, and versus kind of lineage and passing down a name and some sort of head of family status. But both of those, if that's very important, just both for kind of material reasons that you want someone who's going to care for you in old age and provides support for you, and it's from a status point of view, and you want someone to kind of carry on your lineage, then having that son becomes very important when it's always passed through the eldest son. There are also religious rites that matter in Hinduism, and maybe to a lesser extent in Confucianism that helps explain India and China. But I very much like this simple exercise that Avi Ebenstein did in a working paper of his, where he took the census data that's available and the DHS data that's available, and he looked at whether, what are the percent of this, on the horizontal axis is the percent of older men who are living with a son. So these are data where, once you get past kids being young, you don't know, you don't know all of the kids in the family, so you don't know that's an eldest son, but probably chances are this is, but because in other societies you might not have multi-generational families, or you might sometimes be living with your daughter, but in societies where there's a larger fraction of elderly men who are in the same household as a son, you see a more skewed sex ratio. So this is, what is this? Is it's a nice measure of patrilocality as it's still practiced today. Not just in some cultural norm, but in a very concrete aspect, which is your son is going to be taking care of you when you're older. In societies where that remains more common, you see a more skewed sex ratio. And and so on these countries on the right are the ones that are high on this, and they also have a skewed sex ratio. And so China and India and Vietnam, and I think the other, this maybe is less widely known, of how skewed the sex ratio is in the Caucasus, so in Armenia and Azerbaijan, to a lesser extent in Uzbekistan. And I'll come to this later on in the talk, but I think one big reason, these are patrilocal societies, they've been patrilocal for a long time. Their skewed sex ratio started much later than India's or China's, and it's really after the fall of communism when fertility rates fell dramatically. So I think the fertility rate in some of these countries right now is like 1.3. So after communism, fertility, there was economic upheaval, and for various reasons, fertility fell in a lot of the former Soviet satellites and republics. But there might have always been this latent desire for having sons, but people were having their son because they were having large family sizes. Once you have to have a fertility level of 1.2, and that's not because a lot of people are having 0 kids, it's that a lot of families are having 1 or 2 kids. Now obviously the chance of having a son if you're just having 1 child is 50%, and that people are dissatisfied without having that son, and that's part of what's going on in the Caucasus. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about more about sort of female labor force participation in India, but I think it's at least worth mentioning that almost as like a teaser or an invitation to the audience of like seeing the link, because I think the other big exceptionalism in India is the low female labor force participation. So here, there's a lot of reasons why people have suggested it's not necessarily a secular improvement. There might be this U-shape, but even when you do the U-shape, India is below what you would expect. Or you can even use things like, some people in the room are probably familiar with this work that looks at soil types and the plow and agriculture and ancient agriculture, and does that explain what's going on? When you do that exercise, India is still far below the regression line. So any kind of deep cause people think about, there's still kind of an exceptionalism about India in terms of female labor force participation. And so, in terms of the teaser, like I guess I've spent a lot of time just speculating, not in my research, but just trying to understand and like ask people if they think these two phenomena are related in any way, or like in terms of their deep causes. So I said that I think sort of religion and patrilocality, but more patrilocality than religion, is explaining this desire to have sons. I don't think that's explaining the reason why there's limited female labor force participation in India. To the extent that, the extent that I can think of like what's the cultural root of it, it seems much more about this sort of wanting to protect women's sexual purity and chastity, this idea of purity. And I think this is consistent with the fact that if you say, who else has a skewed sex ratio like India? It's China and these countries I mentioned. Who else is like India and having a very low, below the regression line female labor force participation? It's not those countries at all. It's a very different set of countries. Like Iran is, I think, labeled on this figure. But you would also see Saudi Arabia, or kind of countries that are also have various cultural restrictions about women's mobility and interactions with men outside their families. And so I think of them as like India is exceptional in these two reasons, in these two different facets. It's in a club with a different set of countries, and it seems to be not so closely related into the deep roots, but I'm very open to people telling me that's wrong and they see deeper connections between the two of them. That being said, I do think these two phenomena reinforce each other. So I think the dearth of this fact that there's a skewed sex ratio, and that's made it harder to find a wife, and so there are a lot of men who are unable to find a bride or dissatisfied with when they think about their future marriage prospects. And one can speculate that probably is not a great phenomenon in terms of the actual violence and harassment that women are facing. And so there are a couple papers that look at different aspects from survey data of reported sexual harassment or sexual assault that see this correlation. If you look across districts in India where there's a more skewed sex ratio, fewer women relative to men, you also see more of this harassment. It might not be causal, but it's at least suggestive of that. And clearly that harassment and violence is one of the factors that's keeping female labor force participation low in India. You know, and as I said, I think that this desire to have this heir, this son, eldest son, is what's driving the skewed sex ratio. That's the primary thing. But it doesn't mean that other factors aren't on the margin, you know, also making parents want sons more than daughters. And so certainly you hear parents talk about the difficulty of raising a daughter. You know, not just dowry and the expenses, but just the sort of stress and risk they face of protecting their daughter's, you know, safety / purity. So this is, you know, this fact that of this like risk to women and caring about, you know, this risk to women is also potentially making the sex ratio more skewed. Okay, so that's kind of on, you know, at least trying to document what do I think are, you know, what do I think is explaining or why there is this preference for sons, and especially to have an eldest son in India. Now I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of it and really dive into, or maybe dive is too deep of a word, you know, give a very brief overview of 3 of my projects that speak to this. So this is what I was saying earlier, that there are 2 kinds of aspects of son preference, and partly this is for people who work on this. It's also maybe like a request for more clarity. I think it's useful to, you know, the term son preference, people could choose to use it however they want, but I do think kind of, you know, being precise in which aspect of it you're thinking about is useful. And as I said, I think both exist in India. India is probably worse than other parts of the world, but one is a much more general phenomenon, and at least this idea of investment in daughters versus sons, I'm more optimistic that, you know, economic progress will help than I am about the desire to have a son. Okay, so, you know, how does the desire to have a son affect people's fertility? There are basically 2 different strategies you can use if you are not satisfied with what the luck of the draw is giving you and you want to have this eldest son. So one is you keep having children until you have the number of sons you want. This is why I was saying that, you know, historically this was the only thing available to you besides, you know, infanticide or extreme neglect. And today it's still a, you know, commonly used way of achieving sons. So I think, you know, like one view is that once people have access to abortion and sex-selective technologies, they won't enlarge their family size to get their sons. That's not true. You know, there are lots of reasons people don't want to have abortions, whether that's financial costs or health costs or psychic costs. And so, you know, insofar as you can try to kind of get a sense of this, you know, using NFHS data and some, you know, my sense is that a lot of people are still choosing to have more children to get their number of sons. Maybe eventually they, you know, or it's like, okay, I wanted to have 2 kids, let me try a 3rd kid. You know, maybe on the 3rd kid, if they still have another girl, they'll say, fine, I'll use sex selection. But so one is, you know, you keep having children, and so what is that going to mean? You know, it's going to mean that after you have the birth of a daughter, you know, you were hoping for a son, and so you say, okay, fine, I didn't get my son, but I'll try again and have a son. And then the second strategy is to have a sex-selective abortion, so that now we have technologies to, you know, determine the sex of a fetus, and so people can choose even, you know, to avoid having that daughter in the first place, and you know, try again for a son, but without having that daughter in the first place. You know, and obviously, like I mentioned infanticide, so certainly these aren't the only 2 things, but I think the psychic and the costs, or all the costs of abortion, based on what you're seeing in the data, you know, I think that's going to today is much more common than infanticide. So I don't think when we look at how skewed the sex ratio is, that's because there was a spike up in infanticide. Okay, so yeah, I think I'll have a figure later about the skewed sex ratio. So, you know, what happens when you try again to have another child after you have a daughter? So, you know, it's going to affect there are various ways in which it's going to affect the investment in that daughter. And so kind of the theme of this first couple of papers I'm going to talk about of mine are that girls' health is going to be hurt by this desire to have a son, as an unintended consequence of fertility decisions. So this is different from a conscious decision to say, I have sons and daughters, I don't care enough, spending money on health care and is expensive and I don't care as much about my daughter. There's some other, I think maybe less appreciated ways that daughter's health is hurt, not through this conscious choice to invest less in her, but as some collateral damage, some unintended consequence of wanting to have that son. And the two things I'm going to talk about that happens through is, one is it's going to affect birth spacing, or just because after you have that daughter, you're going to have another child. She's going to have a younger sibling. So, and often people are going to be in a hurry to have that extra child. So imagine you're a couple that doesn't have a son. You have in-laws and parents who want you to have a son. Maybe you personally want to have a son, and you're anxious to have that happen. And so that birth spacing is going to be shorter. And so that's going to have consequences for the daughters. And then also, girls are going to be in larger family sizes. So Shelley Clark has a nice paper from 2000 in demography that kind of shows this fact that that girls. I said that historically, when you stop with the last son, you keep having children until you have enough sons. That's not going to skew the population sex ratio, but it is going to make family sizes larger, and it's going to mean girls are disproportionately in larger families. So if you looked within the sex ratio in families, in large families there are going to be more girls, and in small families there are going to be more boys. So imagine you wanted 2 kids and you really wanted a son, and you had boy, and you stop, that's a small family, and it's 100% boys. Now imagine you had another family that also wanted 2 kids, but they had girl, and they weren't satisfied, so they had another child. They got lucky and they had a son, or maybe they got unlucky again and they had a daughter, and so then they tried again and they had a son. That's going to be a larger family size of 4 kids, and that's going to be 25% boys. So the sex ratio within those families is different. And so that matters just because even if parents, once they had kids, said, I'm going to spend an equal amount on my kids. I'm going to spend 1/4 of if I have 4 kids, they're each going to get 1/4 of the spending I have, the food amount we have for food. That the family's income didn't double when they had 4 kids versus 2 kids. They're still earning the same amount of money, and so those girls are going to have fewer resources. So even if the parents were equitable once they had their family size, girls are going to be disadvantaged. So that's point has been in the literature, but the second example I'm going to talk about is maybe adds a twist to that, which is that family size is also larger than was anticipated. That the fact that you didn't plan ahead for that is going to have further consequences that are going to hurt girls. Okay, so this is a figure from a study of mine with Ilyana Kuzhenko that was about the fact that in India, and since then people have replicated this in Egypt and Pakistan, kind of places where there does seem to be this desire to have sons, you see this pattern that boys are breastfed for longer than girls. So this is a survival curve. This is if you look at different ages of kids in the NFHS, the National Family Health Survey, and you look whether the child is still being nursed, for boys at any age, once you get past 6 months, the boys are going to be more likely to still be breastfed than the daughters. And so this amounts to about 1 month extra. And and I'll come back to this, in a couple slides, but if you showed this to an audience who thinks about breastfeeding in the context of the US, they would say, oh, the first 6 months are the really vulnerable, that's when it really matters in terms of immunological development, et cetera, or all sorts of reasons. But in places that don't think in a poor family in rural India, even breastfeeding later is important for health, mostly because the counterfactual food or milk is going to be less nutritious and less hygienic. So that might be water or cow's milk, buffalo milk, or some not too nutritious source of grains or something like that. And so in that sense, it's like still ends up being important for health even at later ages. So this phenomenon, I guess one way of saying this is like, okay, this is not terribly, why look at breastfeeding, there would be a lot of health inputs we could look at, and we would see a same pattern. If I showed you vaccination rates or going to a postnatal visit, you would see that there's a gender gap favoring boys in India. So parents, they have that same annual review article I took those figures from, I think the starkest statistic or study I cite in that is there's somebody did a study in I think a South Delhi clinic where kids were diagnosed with congenital heart defects, and their parents were advised that they should get surgery, that they had a potentially life-threatening congenital heart defect, and please get surgery. So then these researchers followed up with those families 1 year later, and 70% of the boys had their parents had spent the money and gotten that surgery, and something like 44% of the girls, they had gotten that surgery. So that was, might not be a conscious decision. It's not like parents have like twins, a boy and a girl, and they realize gender is what's driving their decision. But de facto, over the sample, you're seeing, whether conscious or not, families are very systematically investing more in sons versus daughters. And, that could be what's going on here, but it's not. The punchline of this project is that explains a little bit of this gender gap, this like idea that parents know what I just told you, that nursing is going to make children healthier, they're going to be less stunted, they're going to be less likely to die. That's not what's driving this gender gap, or most of this gender gap. It's really an unintended consequence of wanting to have wanting to keep having children, to have a son. So, if after the birth of a daughter, parents want to have another child, because they want to try for that son, that means the next pregnancy, or just the fact that there's another pregnancy, is going to be higher, and if we're going to have another child anyway, it's going to be quicker. And so that's going to mean they're going to have earlier weaning of that first child, or the existing child. So one reason you might, if you wanted to have another child, you would stop breastfeeding this child, is because this medical fact that when you are nursing, you are less able to conceive. So breastfeeding is a natural contraceptive. Actually I think we kind of came in thinking that was the main driver of this. I actually don't think it is, partly because not everybody knows that breastfeeding reduces fecundity, the ability to conceive. When you look in the NFHS and you ask people are asked why they're not using contraceptives, a good number say because I'm breastfeeding. So clearly some people know, but I haven't seen anything that sort of quizzed people and saw what percentage of people know. But I'd be surprised if it's 70% or higher. Plus, breastfeeding doesn't completely reduce your ability to conceive. It's not a very reliable form of contraception, especially when we're talking about where this gap opens up of 9 months, 12 months, 15 months. The kids aren't being exclusively breastfed, and the women's ability to conceive is still lower because they're breastfeeding, but not that much lower. So the other reason is simply that the women got pregnant again, and then the fact of getting pregnant is what triggered them to stop breastfeeding. Or sometimes it's like the next birth, but and this might be like a social reason, a norm. It might be for health reasons that they have less energy. But the fact of the matter is, the event that triggers many women to stop breastfeeding one child is they became pregnant again. And so, that wasn't a conscious decision to not, because breastfeeding was going to affect their fertility. It was just the fact of the matter is that they were trying to get pregnant. They did, and that affected the fertility. And so, and so part of what this project is trying to do is say, okay, is this right? I just told you two different reasons you might have a gender gap. One was a conscious decision to provide more of a healthy input to sons over daughters. The other was this unintended consequence of just this desire to get your son. And so we have, kind of various predictions in this project to test which one is more important, and is this theory right that it's like fertility decisions that are driving this. And so one is that, the largest gender gap in breastfeeding should be when the family, would have stopped having kids if they had a son, but because they just had a daughter, they're going to continue to have kids. That's not always the case. At very early, after the first birth, most people don't want just one child, so whether they had a son or a daughter, they were going to keep having kids, And at some point, people might stop. If you had 7 or 8 kids, like the woman's ability to conceive might, after that many pregnancies in a not great health environment, it might be harder for the woman to have kids, or maybe they say, fine, if it was God's will, we're not going to try to have our 7th child to have our son or something like that. But somewhere in the middle, you're going to see that this sex composition of your existing kids was pivotal in your decision whether to have a larger family size. And so we do this 2 ways. One is to kind of look at birth order, but the other is to use these questions in the NFHS on what is your ideal family size? Like how many kids do you want, and what's the sex composition that you want for them? And so, kind of the prediction here is that when you were below your ideal family size anyway, you were going to keep having kids whether you had a son or a daughter. And it's only when, you kind of exceeded your ideal family size, or you've reached your ideal family size, but, you don't have enough sons, that the gender of this last child is going to be pivotal in your decision. And so, what does that predict? And so this is the months breastfed for boys versus girls. And so if it's this desire, it's what's generating the gender gap is this fertility decisions, then when you haven't reached your ideal family size yet, the gender of the kids isn't affecting your fertility, and you shouldn't see a big gender gap. This fertility story would say you should see no gender gap in breastfeeding. You still see a little bit of a gender gap in breastfeeding, and so that's, kind of consistent with boys getting heart surgery more, boys getting vaccinated more. But, but the prediction is like once you've reached, you have as many kids as you actually said you wanted, but you don't have your ideal number of sons, then you would expect the gender gap to be large, and you can see it widens quite a bit then. So in other words, almost all of the overall gender gap in breastfeeding in India is driven by these cases where families are kind of having larger family size than they wanted to get sons. And I mentioned, that eventually when we look at birth order, we can do the same thing. And, over these periods of, this is pooling the first 3 NFHSs, the ideal family size was somewhere between 3 and 4 on average in that data. And you see that, this breastfeeding gender gap kind of peaks exactly around there. And then it actually does diminish after that, in the sense that, once people have 7 kids or 8 kids, then they stop having kids, even if they don't have as many sons as they want. And so so when we kind of go and we can kind of use these estimates and some of our other estimates and say, okay, of this breastfeeding gap, how much of it is from this general desire to give more inputs to sons versus this desire to have sons? It's, the vast majority of it is this desire to have sons. And, it's not trivial in size. We don't try to estimate the causal effect of breastfeeding on mortality. That's not the contribution, but you could do some back of the envelope calculations, and it's something on the order of 10,000, 15,000 girls dying each year because of this gender gap in breastfeeding, which again is like maybe a collateral damage from the desire to have sons. So the second project, kind of on this theme of the consequences for girls of their parents really wanting sons, it's a paper that didn't start out with that being the theme of it. We kind of stumbled upon this explanation. This is a paper with Rohini Pandey that was trying to understand this puzzle of why there's such a high rate of stunting in India. And we started this project very open-ended, just saying, lots of the reasons people talk about as explanations, they're equally bad in sub-Saharan Africa, so the puzzle you really have to explain, any explanation has to be something that's, stronger in India than in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, this paper, I feel like this figure is 90% of this paper, which is, at this point, this figure doesn't have anything to do with son preference. It's just that the stunting puzzle in India is not, it very much differs by birth order. So this is just the raw data where the red is India and the blue is Africa. And these are height for age z-scores. So these are all negative, and a bigger negative number is worse. And overall, if you compared India to the set of sub-Saharan African countries, Indian kids have lower z-scores. There are higher rates of stunting than sub-Saharan Africa, which is a puzzle because India is richer than this sample of sub-Saharan African countries. But that gap is really driven by children who are not the first child in their family. It's children who are the second and especially the third and higher birth order in their family. So if you look at first births in India and first births in Africa, Indian kids are not puzzlingly short. And so this is just the raw data, but we do various things with comparing siblings, not using just Africa as a comparison group, but looking at other comparisons groups, and looking within India of Hindus versus Muslims, because this desire to have sons is stronger among Hindus versus Muslims, and this pattern seems quite robust. And I think this is kind of an important fact, because first of all, we started this during a time when there was this talk of like, oh, this is all genetics, and I think genetics is a very easy excuse to say we don't need to do anything about this, and I think there's no reason to think our genes systematically vary with our birth order, right? So these are siblings, and we see this comparison. They have the same mother and father. Their genotypes are not going to systematically vary. But even if you were kind of on board that this was not genetics, I also think it's, I think there's been a lot of work on sanitation, and I think sanitation is another example that open defecation is worse in India than in Africa, and I think that plays a role. But that can't explain everything. It doesn't explain why two siblings, the older sibling is doing better than the younger sibling. It's not like the family had a toilet and then they destroyed it when the younger child was born, and the younger child is exposed more to open defecation. And so, so I think there's a role for both, but I think this one is, a trickier one to solve. Like, I think it's very tempting to, sort of say it's open defecation. We can throw infrastructure at the problem, and, we know what to build, and I think kind of changing how within a family, within the confines of their homes, parents are giving their sons a glass of milk or an egg, but not their daughters, I think it's a tougher policy challenge, or it's, it's a different, the governments don't, it's not the normal toolkit of policy solutions, like investing in toilets might be, to try to change how parents are, how much food they're giving to their sons versus their daughters, or their later born children versus their eldest children. Okay, so I said, this is about son preference, and that, so then once we saw this, it's not like we came into this project saying, we know that in India, parents seem to favor their earlier born children more than their later born children compared to other parts of the world. And so then it's like, why is this? Why? And I should say, that's for height, but you could do the exact same exercise for inputs. So if you were skeptical of this and said, now I still think it's genetics, you could look at vaccinations. You could look at going to the doctor. All of those, everywhere in the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, including the US, parents invest more in their oldest children. That's a very general phenomenon. It's just more dramatic in India than elsewhere. So you would see vaccinations fall off with later children more, in India than in sub-Saharan Africa, or in compared to Bangladesh, for example. And so, why is that? Why is this birth order preference so strong in India? So the first thing that came to our mind is eldest son preference, that among your sons, your eldest son is always going to be a lower birth order than his brothers. He might not be your first child, but just by definition, if you have two sons in the family, and you had one was born at birth order 2 and one was born at birth order 3, the eldest son is birth order 2, that's earlier birth order. So if among your sons you were favoring your eldest son in terms of all these inputs, you would get a birth order gradient. What explains the drop off we also see, it's not, this birth order gradient I showed you in that bar chart isn't just among boys, you also see it among girls. And among girls, it seems to be related to this fertility continuation. So I'm just going to tell you kind of the stylized story of what's going on, and it's easier to explain if I assume people are myopic, but the same reasoning goes through if they're rational, which is, a family really wanted 2 kids. That's like the modal answer in the NFHS now. They really wanted 2 kids, but they very much wanted to have a son. And so they were optimistic, and they thought they were going to have their 2 children, and they were going to get their son. So they have a daughter, and they give her some resources. They invest in some food and some health care. The doctor says she needs some surgery. They give it to her. They spend money on it. And they were hoping for that son on the second birth. Now they have a second daughter, and that's a very unpleasant surprise because now that's not consistent with having your son and having 2 kids, and so they revise their family size. So, this is the story of girls are in larger families, but with, something dynamic happening, which is you're revising what your plans are. And so now you have a larger family size than you thought, and that you thought you were going to have when you had your first daughter. You have no more resources. And so you still have to save something for that eldest son you're going to have in the future, but you have to start cutting back on spending. So, not everybody is told they need their daughter to have a heart surgery, but I'm going to use this example since I used it earlier. But now, suppose this daughter needs some surgery. You have no more, you have fewer resources now, and you have to spread them over 3 kids instead of 2 kids. This decision of spending money on this daughter is all of a sudden much costlier to you, so you're going to cut back on spending on her. And so that second daughter is going to get fewer resources than that first daughter. It had nothing to do with kind of valuing per se an eldest daughter more than a second daughter. I don't think there's anything quite as strong as this eldest son versus other sons. Eldest daughter is not have some special place in the family, but it's just about wanting to still have that son, wanting to have resources from them, and something has to give. And it's quite important that these early years of life are very important for long-term health. So, say for education, you could spread it out across both daughters and say neither of them is going to get as much education, but, you've already sunk your costs on that first daughter's heart surgery, or more realistically, the, normal medical care and food, et cetera. So that's in the past, but during these, critical, say, first 1,000 days, the second daughter is going to get fewer resources, and because that's so important, that actually have, quite persistent effects on their long-term well-being. And so this idea that the household income needs to be spread across more children, and then the second-born daughters are bearing the brunt of this. So again, this is a case where daughters, in this case, some particular daughters, especially the later-born daughters, are getting fewer resources. Not necessarily because of what we would think of as an explicit preference over these 2 daughters, but through the quest to have a son. So I find this one maybe my favorite figure from the paper, which is it's like an omnibus way of showing you that eldest sons have some special role, and that some preference seems to explain something about stunting in India. So this is 3 panels: girls, sons who are not the firstborn son in their family, and then the eldest sons in families. These blue dots are the sub-Saharan African countries, GDP per capita, and then the average z-scores, and the line is the best fit line. So what do you see? That first of all, GDP per capita does matter for height. Kind of being richer and having more resources and nutrition and sanitation is going to improve height. So that's the blue line. And if you look at the red triangles, India is below the regression line. This is the puzzle of stunting. And so you see that girls are much below the regression line. When you compare non-eldest sons, they're a lot below the regression line. And when you look at eldest sons, they're still below the regression line. It's not that son preference explains all of this puzzle, but they're much closer to that regression line. And so, I find the difference between eldest sons and non-eldest sons, informative, that this is son preference is more nuanced than I favor all boys over all girls. The other fact is that Kerala and the Northeast are much closer to the regression line. So, there are other things different about these states, but they're certainly states where there's less of this strong preference for eldest sons, and this puzzle of stunting is much smaller in those places that have less of son preference. Okay, so the third project I want to talk about is about the skewed sex ratio. So this is where people, those first two projects, it's about continuing to have kids as what's driving, how parents are responding and what's having consequences for girls. The skewed sex ratio is, the consequence for girls is they're not born in the first place. So this is a fact many of you know, that the sex ratio has become much more skewed in China over time and in India over time. And so, what's going on in India, the 80s is when ultrasound and sex-selective sex determination technology became available, and that is, makes aborting a female fetus feasible. You can have an abortion after 20 weeks or what have you when you know it. And this is an example of something where, as I said, like kind of technology progress and time are making this worse. In this case, technology has made this worse. And I think, in terms of the future, I feel like the technology is probably staying ahead of, is improving, faster than the preference is going away. And, now there are blood tests and mobile ultrasounds. It's a hard problem to keep up with. But I think another factor besides technology that we also think of it as modernization or progress that has contributed is falling fertility. So that's obvious in China, where the one-child policy is very, it's aligns time-wise with when things spike up in China, where people by law were only allowed to have one child with exceptions, or at least fined for it. But I think this next project I'm going to talk to you about is about that, that being an important role in India too, not because the government said you have to have fewer children, but because people chose to have fewer children. The demographic transition, fertility has fallen dramatically from what probably 4 in the 70s to 2 point something today. That's a very rapid fall in fertility over a short amount of time. And it's certainly a big factor, could be a big factor in what's going on with the sex ratio. And this is where, for this reasoning to be true, it very much has to be that the preference for sons is not about all sons, you want all your kids to have sons, but about wanting, one to have, caring about this eldest child. And, the logic is quite simple, which is, if you're going to have 5 children, 50-50 chance, roughly, that you'll have a son on each child. So after 5 kids, what's the chance that you had all girls? It's 3%. So it happens, but it's rare. Now people want to have 2 kids. What's the chance that you have 2 kids and you end up without a son? It's 24%. It's not 25% because the actual natural sex ratio is not quite 50-50. And so, there's sort of a greater need to sex select when you have a smaller family size. Having one son naturally is less compatible with a smaller family size than with a larger family size. And so I have a paper in AEJ Applied that did something quite simple that I think is where the goal was to try to understand people's preferences for fertility, where, and I'll maybe sort of make a plug explain a little bit about the methodology, because I do think that the way the NFHS asks this is not necessarily perfect, in the sense of, so there's a paper in demography that says, oh, actually, when family sizes get smaller, that's going to be great. There's going to be less skewed sex ratio. Because what they did is they compared the people who want 2 kids and looked at their ideal family sex ratio, because the question asks, what's your ideal family size and how many do you want to be boys and girls? And it looks, the families that want smaller, fewer kids also have less son preference. And so the punchline of that article was that as we have fertility decline, that's going to make the sex ratio less skewed. But this is just a classic, omitted variable or correlation. Like, some families they're richer, they're more modern, so they're both families that want smaller family sizes, and they might be less traditional in their attitudes. And then other family, just think of like cross states in India, or South Delhi versus some rural village. Then there are other places, the poorer places or the more traditional places, where people want larger families and have strong sex ratios. So it doesn't mean that, those are two different sets of people. They have these two different preferences about son preference and family size. They're correlated. So, I did just a simple exercise of asking people and kind of you could ask someone at five different questions. This was a large sample, so just 1/5 of the people got randomly asked one question and said, if you were going to have 3 kids, or it was actually asked prospectively about parents thinking about their kids, if your son was going to have 3 kids, what would you want the composition to be? Somebody else got asked a question, if your son was going to have 4 kids, what would you want the composition to be? If you had 1 kid, what would you want it to be? So this is sort of separating out. It's like they're being asked at some hypothetical or fixed family size and just asking about what their preference is over the composition. And what you see from that is that one extreme, and I don't know that we're ever going to get to a sense when everybody wants 1 child, but if you ask people, like suppose your child was going to have you're going to have 1 grandchild, what would be the ideal family size? If you're going to have 1 child, what would you want the sex composition to be? Like 80-something% of people say they want it to be a son. And so if we, that's sort of saying, like, if we really got to a point where everybody was having 1 child, there'd be a very skewed sex ratio because people very much want that to be a son. But, once you have 2 kids, the modal choice is to have 1 son, 1 daughter. 2 sons is much more popular than 1 daughter. But, I think interestingly, like, when you ask people if they were going to have 4 kids or 5 kids, what would they want? People want majority daughters. It's not necessarily for good reasons. We also did some qualitative research to understand this, and people say, they don't want controversies with their sons of splitting up property and land, or girls can do more chores. So it's not something to be like, happy about why they want more daughters. Nonetheless, it means that, it's not like they were caring so much about dowry or, really wanted all sons that when they had family sizes of 4, they wanted 4 sons or even 3 sons. Like many more people say they would want 3 daughters and 1 son than 3 sons and 1 daughter. And so, but what this means is that, like, as you get to smaller and smaller family sizes, the desired sex ratio of the family becomes much more skewed towards men. And so, you could take these preferences and then do some calculations and just say, like, okay, so how much does this matter? And so if you just think about the drop in desired fertility, say stated ideal family size in India over since 1980, this decline in desired family size seems to explain about 1/3 to 1/2 of the skewing of the sex ratio. So, obviously access to ultrasound and less expensive and safer abortion is another big factor. That probably explains the majority, but this desire for a smaller family size is a big factor. And I say that because, and I think this is important because that's going to get, it's going to get worse more than before it's going to get better. Maybe everybody in South Delhi wants 2 kids or 1 kid, but in other parts of India, there's still going to be this decline from 4 kids to 3 kids to 2 kids, and we're going to see more pressure there. I think this is, this fact also explains puzzles that, the project I have in Haryana, it's the rich districts in Haryana that are adjacent to Delhi where you see the most skewed sex ratios. It's also helped explain puzzles like the sex ratio has gotten worse in the south, compared to the north. That's also where there was earlier fertility decline in India. So, just as a maybe last, I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes, but, I think this is, this idea of missing girls as an unintended consequence of progress is like very, sort of unsettling or just kind of a sobering point that what we usually think of as progress of technology and women having the ability to have smaller family sizes is something, progress, but there is this unintended consequence that it led to more missing girls. I actually think, this is now speculation, it's not, research findings, but I think the irony is even more severe than that in the sense that, there's this there are a couple things that, say, feminists would celebrate, which is women have access to contraception, they have more say in households, so if women generally want smaller family sizes than men, if women have more power in the household, they can have smaller family sizes. There's better access to contraception. And there's access to safe and affordable abortion. So we think of those as progress for women, but those have also, that combination has led to the more skewed sex ratio. So, as I said, wanting a smaller family and having access to ultrasound and safe abortion means that as an outcome of this greater power and progress from women on one dimension, it's skewing the sex ratio more. I think there's also, this is like the pessimistic slide, maybe the most pessimistic slide, which is, I think it also is, means that some of what we use, our go-to policies to help women might not necessarily help the skewed sex ratio. So we think of increasing women's agency, giving women education will give them more power, and that's going to be great for women and girls. So I think there's often a narrative that the way to help girls is give more power, money in the hands of women. They care more about daughters versus sons in a relative sense, and that's going to help them. But think about this, and this is you can do this. I've done this exercise with the NFHS, and you can show that when women get more education, yes, they report having their ideal sex composition that's less skewed. So there's something about education that makes women seem to care less about having a son or having all sons. They become a little bit more progressive when they think about the sex composition of their children. But when women are more educated, they also want a smaller family size. And so that first factor means, okay, that's great. That's going to make sex selection and this missing girls problem, it's going to lessen the missing girls problem. But the second factor is going to make it worse. And you put those together, and you could say a policy that gave access to women for education or otherwise improve women's agency, that could actually make the sex ratio worse rather than better. When you use the NFHS, it's like a wash. The point estimate is actually that it slightly makes it worse, but it's certainly not this optimistic story we often tell that the path to getting rid of the skewed sex ratio is through women's agency. So I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to talk about, I don't know how many people are going to go to the conference tomorrow, but in terms of policy responses, I'll just give a 2-minute plug or a 2-minute preview of a study and not go into it, go into the details, but I think this is actually a case where the government has done some things to try to solve this problem. I think trying to crack down on sex determination and sex-selective abortion, I find it a reasonably well-enforced law. Places we're working in Haryana have a sex ratio of 1.2 boys for girls, so obviously it's not enough, and maybe there's room for more enforcement, but I think this is a reasonably good enforcement of a law, and it's just not enough. And as I said, the technology is going to probably stay ahead of the enforcement ability. There are also these schemes to have daughters, have a daughter, have 2 daughters, have a sterilization, and you'll get some cash incentives, some money in the bank account of the daughter, especially if she's unmarried at 18. So there are schemes like that. I think the project I have trying to change attitudes in Haryana is born of this view that, I'm not sure, as I said, I'm not sure economic progress is going to solve this. I'm not sure technology is going to help rather than hurt. And what's happening is that the standard economic forces, I'm not seeing any that are diminishing this deep desire to have a son. And so, that sort of, the government proposed, I had started having this conversation with the government of Haryana where they wanted to tweak and evaluate these financial incentives. And, we came back to them and said, would you be open to trying something different where we try to change people's gender attitudes? I'm not an expert on how you do that, but it seems worth trying. How do you get people to value having daughters more than sons, or seeing that it's not the end of the world if they have a family without any sons? The project broadened to not just be about the skewed sex ratio, but to broadly try to change attitudes even about women working and other aspects of gender equality. But I do think that thinking about how you get a mindset change and how you change these social norms about this preference. So these, on the one hand, these are deep cultural preferences that go back centuries. On the other hand, we have some evidence that norms can change. When people have a female pradhan, they start believing women are more competent as politicians and things like that. So, I think it's tough to change cultural norms and people's attitudes. But, I at least don't see kind of easier policy fixes to this desire to have sons, which I think, maybe I'm not realizing it in normal economic progress and some factors I'm not seeing in 20 years it'll go away. But if I look at the history of the last 30 years, India has made a ton of economic progress. There's a ton of progress on closing the gender gap in secondary schooling, for example. But I'm not seeing anything that's kind of narrowing this fundamental desire to have an eldest son in the family. And I think it's an important policy challenge to figure out how to kind of erode the strength of that preference. So thank you. We'll now open up to questions.
Thanks a lot, Professor Jayachandran, for this insightful discussion. I think first of all, I just want to I'm really appreciative of towards ISI and Professor Jayachandran to bring focus on a topic which is at the core of any discussion on gender equality. It is not often these days that you hear a discussion around son preference and how that affects gender equality. So somewhere, thanks so much for bringing this up and putting it on the discussion table. I think it was very interesting to see how Professor Jayachandran started with a very optimistic note on the closing gaps between education and gender equality, and also added to that was the thought-provoking piece of why in India we are unable to do so because of the heavy weight of the cultural norms, of which son preference is such a critical aspect. I think it is also important for us to understand that why is son preference such an important aspect within Indian society? And somewhere it is because of the socio-cultural, political factors that favor men over women. Like if you look at a man is always, the status is always, it's not a balanced, there are unequal power relationship, the status is unequal. And as a result of that, it perpetuates towards this preference for men, preference for son. And it was also very interesting to see the impact of son preference on investments that families make on the children, the family size, the health of children, because there are very few studies in India that have really looked into a birth order and impact on well-being. Like Young Lives is one study which has looked into birth order and how that affects child well-being, looking at but there are, apart from that, there are very few studies. So I think as researchers, the data that Professor Jayachandran has presented is of really importance to us, and to take it forward so that we can have more engagement and more discussion and bring it, bring it to the discourse of the policy makers so that we can have more, transformative policies that will address this unequal gender relations. I think with that, I'll have the floor open for questions. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions together and then we can have responses to that. Do we have a mic there?
Hi. So girls generally have some sort of a natural advantage over boys in terms of height, especially at younger ages. So I just wanted to ask if that's something that has been observed in India as well in terms of the height for age scores for young boys versus young girls. And if it has been observed, then how do you sort of back out the impact of the fact that girls get fewer inputs in their lives, and how do you sort of compare those height for age scores? Thank you.
Yeah, so if you look just at the Z-scores of girls versus boys in India, girls would do better than boys. And so, some people have pointed this to say there isn't any discrimination against girls in India because, let's just do stunting rate so people don't have to do a negative in their head, but the stunting rate is higher for boys in India than girls. And so, one conclusion is boys are discriminated against in India. And so this is where, a reference group is really important. And if you go back and read, Amartya Sen's New York Review of Books or BMJ article on the sex ratio, so this was very important, that you can't just look at the sex ratio and say, what's the natural rate, because maybe the natural rate is different in poor countries and in rich countries, that like there's a lot of evolutionary biology and medical literature that the nutrition environment affects the sex ratio, and so he uses sub-Saharan Africa as a benchmark. And so that's what we have done, kind of, when I say that overall, or when I showed you these plots where Kerala and the Northeast didn't look as bad, that's like all relative to sub-Saharan Africa, because girls, the stunting gap where girls are doing better than boys, have a lower stunting rate than boys, that's, dramatically more so in sub-Saharan Africa than in India, or in Bangladesh than in India, so it's really important for a lot of health outcomes when there are, like I said, like the life expectancy, women live longer than men, so that doesn't mean men are disfavored, at least with health outcomes, there's a lot of biology, and that biology is interacting with the environment, the disease environment, or nutritional resources. So you need some reference group. So this is challenging, it's hard when you look at that to say, are people discriminating against boys in Africa, maybe, and India is neutral, that's kind of a deep challenge with this. I think it's a shockingly little understanding of why in poor countries, especially the Z-scores, or the stunting rate is higher for boys than girls. It's most likely related to the fact that the miscarriage rate of male fetuses is higher, the infant mortality rate, the natural infant mortality rate is higher for boys and girls. Like, boys are vulnerable to disease and other insults, and so I think the interpretation is that some sort of disease environment, a boy is more likely to get sick, and so that's going to lead to worse things. That's true in sub-Saharan Africa. By the way, you see the same thing of infant mortality. The infant mortality rate isn't different between boys and girls in India, and you might say, oh, nothing to worry about, but if you go and look at any other poor country, the infant mortality rate is much higher for boys than girls, and so relative to that, you realize something's different in India, that natural advantage girls have, or that natural disadvantage boys have in survival, is being offset, presumably by something parents or society are doing.
In NFHS, when we use this ideal family size variable to look at the aspiration of a mother to have number of children, it is actually asked at the time of the survey, and not when they've already realized certain number of fertility decisions. So do you think, in light of this, is that a reliable estimate to work around the ideal family size? Just because it is not a question that has been asked before they had any children, but asked at the time of the survey.
Yeah, so it's a retrospective question, and one always wonders, does, like, once people have 2 daughters, are they going to say, I really wanted 1 daughter and 1 son? It's like human nature. So I guess, I think that's certainly part of a challenge. It is shocking how many people say they have more kids than their ideal family size. So it's not completely rationalization, in the sense of, I showed you this graph on the breastfeeding study where I had people who were 2 kids below their ideal family size, 1 below, add it, +2, +3. So, you're asking someone who has 5 kids, if you could go back and do it again, what would your ideal family size be? Someone who has 5 kids says 3. So I couldn't show you that graph unless there were a fair number of people who were saying they wish they had fewer kids than, or ideally they would have fewer kids than they do. So, I guess that's one answer, which is it's not completely ex post rationalization. It is, that is when I showed you, I use this to kind of trace out if people had 2 kids, what would they want? If they had 3 kids, what they would want? In addition to kind of asking at hypothetical, sort of unbundling this, tell me how many kids you want in the composition, to, okay, I'm going to specify to you the family size, you tell me the composition. It was also asked prospectively. So this was I mentioned I randomized, because it was a big sample size. This is the baseline survey of the study I'm going to talk about tomorrow on attitudes, gender attitudes in Haryana. We had a sample size of 15,000 kids at 6,000 parents. But because these were the sample were parents who had an adolescent, so who were at the time in standard 6 or 7. So we asked that prospectively about their kid. So it's different. It's not about their own self, it's about their child, but it's presumably predictive of actual behavior if parents are influencing their kids' views or fertility. And so that was precisely to kind of ask in a forward-looking way. I think there's ways with the NFHS for certain questions, if you were just trying to say categorize how has it changed over the waves, or how is it varying across religion or regions. There are enough people who are surveyed who don't have kids yet, because it's like an age sampling, that you can look at the sample who haven't yet had kids or even aren't married. So maybe, if they're married and they don't have kids, maybe you think they're trying and they've had miscarriages and they've updated. But the people who are not married, I think, are probably for some purposes, you could use that subsample, and then it's not subject to this ex post rationalization.
Does the son preference differ significantly among rich and poor households? Or is it the same, and why is it so?
Yeah, I think that now I'm trying to think if I've looked at within the NFHS, you could look at the wealth quintiles and see these son preference questions. So when we ask in Haryana, it's a reasonably homogeneous sample, so it's not a great place to look by wealth levels, but I think there are kind of two competing things. Like in our sample in Haryana, we generally see that wealthier families have more progressive gender attitudes. So, that's kind of like a urban modernization, mothers are more likely to be educated, sort of a general view of equality. But certain aspects of it are kind of, the importance of certain status and lineage is sort of a luxury good for the wealthy. I think this is related to kind of female labor force participation, that if you're poor, you can't afford to care about the stigma as much as if you're rich. So I think that there isn't a kind of it's not starkly stronger among rich versus poor in terms of the desire to have a son. I would say stated preferences generally seem to be more progressive in rich families, but certain kind of willingness to pay a financial cost to protect those, your attitudes. Poor people can't afford to do that as much. But, I guess I think an important distinction that I'm trying to make in this paper that is about fertility decline is it's useful to make a distinction between a kind of a preference, as we would use it in economics, and how it's realized in the sex ratio. So, two people, rich and poor, might have the exact same son preference if I think of that as like a vector. If you had one kid, what would you want to do? If you had 2 kids, what would you want to do? You have 3 kids. If you're a rich and a poor, they might have that exact same preference, but then there's another kind of preference, which is how many kids do you want to have? And that rich or family person is much more likely to want 2 kids compared to 4 kids. And so, that point in the vector you're going to pull out is the 2-child one, where they're much more likely to, say, have a sex-selective abortion. And so, I think that in that sense, the manifestation or the realization of that preference in certain metrics, like sex-selective abortion, is clearly bigger among the rich. Like I said, it's just, you just look in Haryana, and I haven't done this exercise throughout India, but, it's like what people often think of as puzzling is not puzzling once you look at it through the lens of fertility. Sonipat, Rohtak, they're just richer than other parts of Haryana or UP or Bihar, and so it's not necessarily that there's more intense desire to have a son in those districts. It's just that they're in this, Delhi orbit of perimeter, and people really don't want to have more than 2 kids.
of time, we will just have one more question.
So if I may add to this discussion and to your question. So another aspect to examine is the role of class in the sex ratio at birth. And that's something that I've looked at a little bit. And to answer the question, so when you look at the poor, below the poverty line especially, you tend to find more boys, but that is partly because it's not that there isn't son preference, but they're not utilizing the means, to sex select, et cetera, et cetera. But as soon as you move above that, as soon as you become non-poor, so I related not only to class, but also to mobility strategies of families, then you tend to sex select more. And if we have mapped this against the rise of the deterioration of India's sex ratio, and as you move up, as people became more prosperous, post the 80s with some reforms, etc., you tend to find that the size of the emerging middle class swells. And it suits that class particularly to sex select, because it helps their upward mobility strategies to have more sons. And as you said, then as you move up, which again we have argued and mapped also with NSS data, you find that as people move into the stable middle class, then they tend to discriminate much less. But it's a far more complex story, because land is something very important in rural areas when you look at it. And there, this preference of the first son, and not so much less importance to the younger sons, is quite important when it comes to people with land. And in urban areas, propertied people, you'll find that they will tend to have more sons than people who are not propertied, who are in the service class, et cetera, would tend to care less. So I think it's important also to look at dynamic factors. And I would say that really political economy rather than culture per se. And that's why I don't think dowry independently is an important factor. But if you take in the outgoings through dowry, let's say in an emerging middle class scenario, then dowry becomes very important. Because it's often a stated reason for why people don't want to have daughters. Now, even in our paper on signs of change, we show that actually dowry is not a real reason. But so it's this complex of factors that comes together, which is kind of dynamic, and which hopefully will show that, as we move into better education, more prosperity, people will tend to sex select less. But the fertility factor is kicking in a huge fashion. For example, the very large states of UP and Bihar, they are going to, downsize their fertility. And I have another paper which looks at the zigzag effect of fertility and sex ratios. So that rightly, as you said, when you move from 4 to 3, you're likely to have the sex ratio worsen. When you move to 3 to 2, you're likely to have the sex ratio improve. Now the question is out in the open about what will happen when you move to fertility size of 1. Because then either you're educated and rich enough and don't care, or you still care and you're only going to have sons. So those are some of the reasons.
Thank you, Professor. That's very helpful.
So thanks everybody, and I think that was really a great discussion, and we look forward to having more such discussions going ahead in future. So thanks for your time. Thank you.